Colonial rule brought about far-reaching changes in Indian agriculture. In place of a feudal society, uh, there was the creation of a colonial and semi-feudal society by dismantling the old one. New settlements were introduced in three different regions of the country, and Indian society was brought into the global capitalist, world capitalist network, and Indian agriculture was converted into a raw material supplying appendage to metropolitan Britain. And as a matter of fact, far from introducing a model of development which catered to the needs of the basic masses, what the British did was to introduce a system, the system of colonial rule. It was a system which only catered to the needs of British imperialism. It had many consequences, and one of the major consequences of this change, fundamental transformation, was the creation of a huge mass of alienated and impoverished peasants. Ever-growing indebtedness of the peasants to the usurer, come trader, come middleman, come jamindar, and it was a class which, of course, served as one of the main pillars of colonial rule. Now that brings us to the background. As we know, the British introduced three land settlements in three different parts of the country to serve the interests of the British Raj. And the outcome in a nutshell was as follows. Land became a commodity, alienable property, private property, and peasants' traditional right, occupancy right to land was abolished. And side by side, a new legal system was also introduced, which was based on the concept of private property and contract. And India was drawn into the world capitalist market, and there was greater commercialization, greater penetration of commodity money relationships. And the main purpose of these measures was the extraction of the maximum surplus from the primary producers of the soil. And this extraction of the maximum surplus, it formed the main basis of the early colonial system of plunder. And what is important is that the mode of appropriation was feudal, very much feudal. And this naturally led to the colossal destruction of men, productive forces. And another source of colonial plunder was unequal trade. Unequal trade was added to rent revenue, which was extracted by the colonial state through a large number of intermediaries, that is, newly emerging landlords, moneylenders, traders, mahajans, and others. As a matter of fact, the colonial rule re-established feudal relationships, though on a new basis. The basis was not the same, but it was a new type of refeudalization of Indian agricultural scene. And the main outcome, of course, was landlessness, alienation from land, indebtedness, emergence of a huge mass of landless labor force, impoverishment of the people, basic masses, and side by side there was commercialization of agriculture and commodity money relationship, which also helped in the emergence of rural creditors, a section of the newly emerging rich people, rural creditors. And it was these people who exercised sufficient control over the peasants. Now, in a Bengal presidency, as you all know, land revenue was fixed on a permanent basis. It was a permanent settlement, and the jamindars could also easily enhance their rents by being empowered with some acts, acts of 1799, 1812, and 1819. And a uniform system of coinage was introduced. That is, that the British did in place of the Indian system of coinage, cowries and others. There was introduced money, uniform coinage, which the British introduced, and it helped in it helped in the development of a network of credit, and in this way, the uniform medium of exchange was also extended to many parts of the country. Now, both the peasants and the landlords, they were to pay off their dues to the state. The peasant to the Jamindar rent, and Jamindar revenue to the state, to the colonial state. And both of them, both the peasants as also newly emerging landowning class, they had to borrow money from the moneylenders, from the usurers, and they had to mortgage something against which they could borrow. And the rate of exchange was very high. And when they failed, particularly when the peasants failed to pay off their dues in time, and very often they did fail, then many of them were forced to part with their land, with their small plots of land, and they became landless. Now, this is true not only of Eastern India, but also of other regions as well. Now, rural indebtedness and impoverishment of the peasantry, these were integral parts of feudal India also, that is pre-British India. Although information on this particular theme, we do not have much sufficient information, hard facts about it. Now, yes, this much can be said, that there were, during the time of harvest failures or other common misfortunes, which also was coupled with a meager income of a large number of peasant families. Now, these led them to borrow regularly from other people who had money. And apart from this, there were other developments in East India, such as the recurring Maratha raids during the 1740s, then the exaction of a heavy land revenue from Orissa by the Marathas during 1751 to 1803, the virtual breakdown of the central authority in Assam since 1783, and the miseries that the short Burmese rule caused to the people of Assam. Now, all these created conditions where borrowing was actually unavoidable. If available, you have to borrow. They had to borrow. Irfan Habib spoke of Mughal India, and he pointed out that the extent of peasant indebtedness in Mughal India was very high, and the rates of interest were quite exorbitant. Now, this is the picture of pre-British India, feudal India. Now, rural indebtedness definitely was very high during the British rule. Binay Bhushan Chaudhary has referred to data provided by the Grain Department between 1794 and 1801 to deal with the grain merchants as rural creditors. He says that in Bardwan and Jessore, nearly 50% of the cultivation depended on the advance made by the moneylenders. In Dinajpur, they controlled through such advances the largest part of the peasant's crop, so that the quantity coming to the local market, local hearts, barely sufficed for the normal local consumption. The maximum amount of crops was taken away by those who lent out the money, who gave dadon, who gave advances. So only a small quantity of crops was available for consumption by the local population. In Shahabad and Gaya, as Buchanan found, even rent payment, apart from other financial obligations of the peasants, necessitated borrowing from the moneylenders. One person, Mr. Titler, who was the revenue and judicial officer and who made extensive tours of inspection in many areas, and particularly during the 1810s, he found that 9/10 of the peasants were forced to borrow their food and corn to sow their lands from the Mahajans. So they were dependent even for their own food, on the Mahajans. They had to borrow from them. And the Patna Commissioner, Mr. Metcalf, said in 1875 that the agriculturist regards a village without a moneylender as an abnormal state of things. One cannot have any village without a moneylender. In medieval Europe, one cannot have any village without the lord, without any manor without the lord. So in our country, there was hardly any village which had no moneylender in it. Now, in the districts of Bengal, there existed both organized markets as also unorganized markets. The organized markets were controlled by the Aratiyas or wholesale dealers, and in the unorganized markets, there are many petty traders who were involved. Rice and jute were the two most important crops besides tea that was exported from the region. And in all these commodities, there existed big trading farms. In addition to the mills operating from Calcutta, controlling the market prices of these crops. And there are many foreign farms which are involved, British farms which are involved, Raleigh brothers, Graham and Shaw Wallace, for instance, they were engaged in rice trade. And the peasants sold both paddy and husk rice, generally to the village Baparis. Bapari was another intermediary, Bapari to Arodhar. First you have the Bapari, then we have the Arodhar. And the Baparis also acted as agents of the Arodhars of the rice mills. And in fact, in the mid-1930s, Arodhars controlled 14% of the paddy and 10% of the rice marketed. It is a huge quantity. Now, all these were feudal fetters, no doubt, which were closely tied up with the colonial setup. Bengal at one time was self-sufficient in sugar, and for the cultivation of sugar cane, since its cultivation was very expensive, so peasants had to depend also on the moneylender. In Rajshahi, cultivators took advances at the commencement of the season, and they repaid the debt in gur. The same was true of Pabna. Now, the expansion of jute cultivation, that is a commercial crop, cash crop. Now, that was the reason behind the ruin of the sugar industry. And the whole business of jute and seed distribution was in the hands of moneylenders, rural moneylenders. And so the indebtedness of the peasants was all pervading. In Nodia district, for instance, more than 75% of the peasants were clients of the moneylenders. So that was the situation. Omid Bhaduri, another scholar, has pointed out that commercialization of tenurial rights in land and the consequent increasing claims by the expanding class of rent-receiving intermediaries caused a steady decline of the consumption level of the peasants. In such a situation, it was next to impossible for the peasant to generate surplus. Who can generate a surplus? Someone who can first make both ends meet, there is a surplus for him, and then he could invest it. But there was no scope for such activities because of the situation. They were so much dependent, they were so much indebted, that they were throughout, even for their own sustenance, their own food, which they themselves would take, they had to depend on moneylenders. And whenever the peasants failed to repay their debt in time, either they would have to part with their land, or they would borrow more and more at high rates of interest. And so what took place was something like a debt bondage. They became totally indebted to the peasants. It's a new type of debt bondage, which was a product of colonial rule. Now, what we see is that this commercialization definitely led to depeasantization or differentiation of the peasantry. We have the emergence of the rich peasants and the emergence of a huge mass of landless laborers, landless peasants, poor peasants who became landless when they were forced to part with their land. Now, what is important here is that, and it is generally agreed, that this situation possibly did not lead to the concentration of landholding. because there was more and more subletting of land, not a concentration of land, but more and more subletting of land, and the growth of the sharecropping system, the Bargadari system, the sharecropping system. So this was also a product of colonial rule. In South India, as we know, Rayatwari system was introduced, and it was an agreement between the government and the Rayat, or between the state and the Rayat. And the changes in the agrarian economy here were due to the rise of substantial middle peasants who had established a direct access to the market. And here Marwaris, the role of the Marwaris is very important. Marwari businessmen, they migrated to the Krishna Godavari region, and they provided the credit. In fact, they migrated to all parts of India, to Eastern India, to South India, to Western India, many parts of the country, to North India. And here the farming was overwhelmingly dominated by the large landholders or Mirasdar peasants, Mirasdars. The land of the Mirasdars or large landholders was cultivated by the tenants in exchange for grains as wages and by bonded laborers. Now, speaking of South India, Dharma Kumar pointed out that very high rates of revenue were imposed, and these acted as severest brake on agricultural production. When you are extracting a heavy amount of revenue, a huge amount of rent, then you cannot expect any development of the productive forces, primary producers of the soil. And maximum rents, maximum aboabs, or illegal exactions were there. And in the face of these onslaughts, the peasants were absolutely helpless. There was no one to support him, to back him. These things, of course, led to indebtedness and the concentration of wealth in the new breed of usurers, moneylenders, and others. In Madras Presidency also the situation was the same. It has been pointed out by Dharma Kumar that cash debts were extensive in the Tamil area, but rare in some dry Telugu districts, where there was little commercialization. According to Srinivas Raghava Iyengar's report of 1893, the moneylender was more powerful in areas which were less commercialized. In central provinces, particularly Sagar and Narmada areas, the revenue demand was also pitched at a very high rate. Here, tenants were exposed to a different kind of insecurity. It's a new kind, possibly. A large installment of the revenue was to be paid in the month of February. And as a result, the landlords used to collect the rents from the peasants in January when the crops were still lying in the field. So, since the crops were still lying in the field, and if the peasants were to pay off their rents to the lords, then he would again have to borrow money from the same lords, from the same moneylenders, in order to pay off their rents. Because if they paid their rents, then the lords would be able to pay off their revenue to the state. So, in order to make room for the lords to pay off their revenue to the state, they were forced to pay off their rent 1 month earlier, that is, in the month of January rather than in the month of February. So, indebtedness was the result, more and more indebtedness. Another point is that as a revenue settlement was temporary, and the settlement officers alone could fix the rents, so the civil court could not question any rent so fixed. So the peasant could not expect to go to the court to get redressal of the grievances. So what all these mean is more and more indebtedness, more and more depeasantization, more and more impoverishment of the peasantry.
Sir, what is the difference between surplus product and necessary product?
Necessary product is that which is needed for the minimum subsistence. In order to simply keep oneself alive, you will have to take some food minimum amount of food, and that is a necessary part of it. That is absolutely necessary for you to make both ends meet. That is necessary. And anything which stands above, over and above this necessary part is surplus. That is with which you can buy something, you can invest a part of it in land for the purchase of some manure, for some tool maybe from the artisans. So that is a surplus one. But what we find here is that there is no surplus product for the peasant, nothing, because he was deprived of everything, because of the burden, because of the pressure, economic pressure. And even a part of the necessary product was also taken away from him. For the lords, everything is surplus for them. Because they are not doing nothing, they are making no investment, and they are extracting as many as possible, as many surplus as possible. But for the peasants, they were being deprived not only of the surplus, entire amount of the surplus, if at all, but also a part of the necessary product. And you cannot expect the development of productive forces in such a situation. So that is part of the feudal system. Had it been a capitalist system, the situation would have been otherwise. It could not have been in this way.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Sir, how did the Suez Canal and the development of the railways affect the peasant indebtedness?
No, Suez Canal, opening of the Suez Canal meant that there could be export of both food items as also non-food items. And the introduction of the railway system in the second half of the 19th century, particularly after the revolt of 1857-58, it helped in the shifting of commodities from one place to another, from the interior to the port cities, for their subsequent shipment abroad. So when communication network was strengthened, so definitely it helped in making more and more production. And that means more and more burdens on the peasants. And the peasants were, they're already indebted. And so more and more burdens on them. So this is the relationship between the opening of the Suez Canal, extension of the railway system, and increase in peasant indebtedness.